thank you guys for making the time. I know everyone's pretty busy these days, but I'm happy to have you here. Today we'll be talking about bedtime and some of the common struggles that parents face with bedtime and some strategies that you can use to help with the challenges that you're seeing around bedtime. Just a brief introduction. So my name's Alissa Greenberg. I'm a licensed psychologist and board certified behavior analyst. I have a practice that's called Focused Behavioral Solutions, and I work with families whose children have challenging behaviors or skill deficits, and I do parent training. So I'm teaching parents how to use behavioral strategies to work on whatever challenges they're seeing at home. And one of those might be bedtime. So I will go ahead and get started. A quick disclaimer, even though I am a licensed psychologist, that this webinar is just for informational purposes. So unless we're already in a client contract, your attendance does not constitute a therapeutic relationship, and I encourage folks to reach out to support if they need it. Okay. But here we go. So this is what we're going to be addressing today. What defines good sleep and why is it important? And then we'll go through some of the common sleep issues that families encounter. What I'll be talking about when we get into strategies is what to do around bedtime, so how to create a healthier bedtime routine, things to consider with your child's bedroom, and then I'll be talking about what's called sleep dependencies. So I'll be defining that later on, and then I'll talk about what to do to help your child fall asleep on their own. All right. So we'll start with talking about what defines healthy sleep. I don't know if you experience this, Andy, or not, but I hope, my hope is that parents are getting good sleep in addition to their children, because I think there are some real benefits to sleep that we'll talk about. In terms of children and what type of sleep we're looking for, or what amount of sleep we're looking for, it's going to vary based on your child's age. And these are really just averages. So if your child is getting less or more than this, it's not on its own a cause for concern. These are just some guidelines to keep in mind. And for younger children, of course, you'll see their night sleep in this column, in addition to naps. As children get older, you'll start to see those naps fade, and then the only sleep they're getting is during the night. So for 2.5-year-olds, we would be looking for them to sleep anywhere from 9.5 to 10 hours at night, and then getting these naps during the day. Okay. So what does good sleep look like? Well, there are a couple things to keep in mind. And this is for children and also adults. So the first is that you want your child to be able to fall asleep quickly, which means that within about anywhere from a couple minutes to, I would say, 15 minutes would be on the kind of high end, that from when they get in their bed, that's when they're falling asleep. Same as for adults, you don't want to be lying in bed awake for long periods of time. And that comes back to these kind of sleep dependencies or cues that we'll talk about later on. But that's the goal, is that once they're in bed, they're falling asleep pretty quickly. The next goal is that they're staying asleep throughout the night. So this is actually not 100% true, because we actually all wake up throughout the night. Children and adults are waking up multiple times throughout the night, but if most of us, you are waking up, but you're falling asleep, back asleep right away, and you don't even remember that you woke up. I know for myself, there are nights when I might be more anxious or feeling stressed about something. And then if I wake up, I'm kind of thinking about those things, and I definitely remember that in the morning. But the goal is for your child to stay asleep throughout the night. Another goal is that you're waking up easily in the morning, so that when you wake up, you're not really feeling groggy. It's a kind of relatively easy transition from sleep to waking up. And then lastly, that you're staying alert during the day, so you're not drowsy, or your child isn't drowsy throughout the day. Those are signs that they're getting enough sleep at night. Okay, so why is sleep important? Well, we know that if your child isn't getting sleep, we might start to see some more behavioral challenges during the day. So as if we see a decrease in sleep, then we're likely to see an increase in some of these behaviors. So irritability is on here twice, but that is a consequence of not getting enough sleep. Your child would be more irritable. There also less sleep can lead to inattention during the day, or increases in problem behavior. So we might see in some children even increases in aggression or stereotypical behavior if they're not getting enough sleep at night. Also, if your children aren't getting good sleep, it can cause some issues for the parents. So decreases in sleep is related to an increase in maternal depression, or sleep problems for the parents, or even marital discord. So we all know that sleep is important for all of us. However, 35 to 50% of young children experience sleep problems. So even though sleep is important, these sleep issues are actually pretty common. This number is even higher in children with a developmental disability, so children who have an autism diagnosis or ADHD diagnosis, who are more likely to experience sleep problems. Okay, so here are some common issues that we might see in children. So there's nighttime routine non-compliance. Non-compliance just means difficulty listening. And you can see this throughout the day, but some families see an increase in that non-compliance during bedtime. So children just aren't listening during that routine or throughout that routine. Another issue that is common in children is difficulty falling asleep. So once you get your child to bed, it's taking them a while to fall asleep, or they're just constantly asking for things, or don't want their parent to leave, things like that. Another issue we might see with children is night awakening. So after they go to sleep, they're waking up frequently throughout the night. Also, in young children, it's common to see early awakenings where kids are waking up well before their parents want them to, and are waking up their parents. And another one that we might see in children is bedwetting. So in most of the presentation is geared towards, I would say, the first two, and some of the night awakenings also will address. Okay, so the first one that I want to get into is a bedtime routine. Routines are really important for everyone, not just children, adults as well. And once you're able to establish a consistent bedtime routine that's keeping in mind all three of these variables, not just the consistency, that can really help with the non-compliance. What I'm going to do is dive into each of these components in a little more detail. So first is consistency. With consistency, there are a couple things to keep in mind. So one is, just like it sounds like, kind of having that same routine that you're trying to stick to as much as possible every day of the week, so that the order of activities that your child goes through before bed is relatively consistent. And another piece to keep in mind is maintaining that consistency if there are two parents in the household. So maintaining that if mom or dad is putting the child to bed. So that's one piece with consistency. The other one is related to timing, which I'll get into next, is kind of having your child go to bed at the same time every night of the week, which we can often see kind of in the summer that schedule kind of goes out the window, or even during the school year, there's kind of this difference between weekday bedtime and weekend bedtime, which you want to try to minimize as much as possible. The benefit of consistency is really addressing that non-compliance piece. So if your child knows what to expect at bedtime and knows the order of activities, you're less likely to see that non-compliance because your child starts to learn that there's less wiggle room to get out of those steps within the bedtime routine. So that's just one of the benefits of having a consistent bedtime routine. Okay. The next one is timing. So with timing, there are a couple different factors here. One is thinking about what's happening in the house before your child's bedtime, and about an hour before you put your child to bed, you want to start to consider kind of getting your child in that state that's getting them ready for sleep. So about an hour before bedtime, you want to start dimming the lights throughout the house. So in kind of whatever room you're in, maybe starting to dim the lights if that's possible. The other one is thinking about what activities is your child doing within that time frame, and trying to avoid really overstimulating activity. So you want to avoid physical activity during the time frame. The other activity to look out for is screen time. There's research on this that if you're exposed to a screen before you go to bed, and this would be for children and adults, that you're more likely to have kind of your sleep is impaired. So it's more difficult for you to fall asleep, but also throughout the night, your sleep isn't as healthy as it is if you're avoiding the screen time right before bedtime. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The other component with timing is thinking about, okay, when are you putting your child to bed? And what I do with families is think about what's your goal bedtime. So maybe the goal bedtime is something like 8 or 8:30 for your child. When you're starting out intervention for bedtime, often what I encourage families to do, which sounds a little counterintuitive, but I'll explain why. I often encourage families to actually start bedtime later rather than at that goal bedtime. And there are a couple of reasons why. So when we're starting off an intervention, we want your child's biology, or kind of what's going on physiologically, to work in our favor. So we want them to be sleepy so that when they get to bed, they're falling asleep quickly. So we'll actually start off with bedtime later than what our goal is. And that time difference varies based on the families that I work with, but I would do even longer, especially if children are really struggling with that piece of falling asleep once they're in bed. So we'll push back bedtime with the goal of going through the bedtime routine, and then once they get to bed, they're falling asleep pretty quickly. Once we start to see that, then we start gradually moving up bedtime until we get to that ideal bedtime, whatever your goal bedtime is. Like I said, whether that's 8 or 8:30, that timing will depend on the age of your child. So those are some things to keep in mind with timing. The last piece I want to mention here is that in children, often we'll see, and adults experience this too, actually, it's just our kind of natural circadian rhythms, that will experience what's called a forbidden zone in the evening. And the exact timing of that varies based on your age and just your own kind of individual physiology. But the forbidden zone is when we actually experience an increase in energy levels. And what is sometimes happening is parents are starting bedtime, that routine, during the forbidden zone when their kids are demonstrating an increased energy level, and it's making that bedtime routine much more difficult for the whole family. And we might also see that might be one of the reasons why we see an increase in non-compliance during that bedtime routine. So it's something to be on the lookout for. And again, I can't give you an exact time of when that happens. It's usually sometime in the evening, a couple hours before bedtime. But we want to make sure that we're not starting that bedtime routine within that zone when you're seeing that increase in energy level in your child. Okay. Last component to keep in mind with a bedtime routine is using visuals. So this is something that I recommend for lots of different strategies, but I think they work well with any of these routine activities. So when we have a routine, there's this sequence of steps that we want your child to follow, and with a consistency, they're going to stay the same generally across different days of the week. So what we'll do is, depending on the age of your child and what interests them, it could be as simple as just writing out the steps of their bedtime routine so that they can see that order. But for some children, we'll write it out. So it might say kind of bath time, and then we'll have a picture of a bathtub. And these, you don't have to get fancy with this. You can do like line drawings, or find some basic pictures online and print up something for your child. But that visual can really help. And what I also encourage families to do is put a checkbox next to each step on that routine. And as your child goes through each step, they get to mark it off, or put a smiley face in it, or put a sticker or stamp in that box next to that activity. And that does a couple of things. One, it allows for that sense of accomplishment. So as they're going through, they're getting some reinforcement throughout that routine. But the visual also lets them see what they've done and what's next. It also makes the bedtime routine more concrete for them, and again helps with that non-compliance because they can see the order of steps there. So when they see that order of steps, they're less likely to ask for things that aren't on that sequence. And of course, it will take them time and repeated exposure and practice to learn how to follow that routine successfully, but using the visual aid can really help with that. Okay, so those are the main things to keep in mind with a bedtime routine. I'm going to pause there. Andy, do you have any questions about what I've talked about so far?
No, I don't think so. That seems like
Okay. All right, so in addition to the routine, there are some factors, more just kind of environmental factors we want to consider with our child's bedroom. And here they are. So I'll go through each of them. So the first is lighting. And like I said, about an hour before bedtime, you want to start dimming the lights throughout the house. When you are actually putting your child to bed, you want the room to be as dark as possible. I know some children need a night light on it, and that's fine. You just want that to be ambient light that's kind of low and below their eye level. That would be ideal. The other factor to keep in mind is temperature. So the research shows that you'll actually sleep better in cooler temperatures than warmer ones. And I know some families like kind of keeping the bedroom at a higher temperature just because they don't want their child to get cold throughout the night. They're worried about that. But actually, cooler temperatures do tend to lead to better sleep throughout the night. So keeping that in mind, you might want to start kind of bringing down the temperature of the house before bedtime. Another one is noise level. So of course, wanting to keep the noise level low in your child's bedroom, but also throughout the house. And that can be difficult to do if there are siblings who stay up later or parents who need to kind of get other things done, and those noises might be distracting to their child. But you do want to try to keep those noises down. Okay, so along with noise level, you want to think about if you are playing music for your child before bedtime. And this ties into what I'm going to talk about next with these sleep dependencies. So I'm going to pause on that. We'll come back to it. But with noise, ideally it's quiet, or there's this kind of constant ambient noise, like a white noise machine. That can work really well. That's something you can keep on throughout the night, and that can block out noises and the rest of the household that might be happening after your child goes to bed. Okay. Lastly, with the bedroom is thinking about what activities are in the bedroom available to your child. Sometimes we'll see that after you get your child in bed, they're distracted by all these fun things in their room. And that can be kind of a competing contingency for your child of, why would I want to sleep when I could play with all these cool things? So really thinking about what's in your child's room and trying to minimize those distractions. So keeping things like books in there, but if there are other kind of activities that your child really enjoys, thinking about, is there anywhere else in the house where we could store those instead of in the room? Okay. So I want to get into now these sleep dependencies. So I'm going to talk about what they are and then things to keep in mind. Sleep dependencies, the kind of formal definition would be these are stimuli are associated with falling asleep. So now I'll talk about like what that means in plain English. So we all kind of form these habits and we get used to certain things. So I have this kind of very consistent bedtime routine that I've been following for probably like the past 15 years. But one of my sleep dependencies is that when I'm in my room at night, I put on meditation music, and I've been listening to the same meditation music like this whole time frame for about the past 15 years. So this is a very strong sleep dependency for me. Then what it does is it actually helps me fall asleep, so that when I hear that music, that sets a cue to my body that, okay, it's time to fall asleep now. So sleep dependencies can work in our favor, but they can also work against us, because what happens with young children is that they're often forming these sleep dependencies that become difficult for the family to maintain over time, and that aren't always present in the middle of the night if your child wakes up in the middle of the night. So some things to keep in mind with sleep dependencies are that you don't want them to depend on another person. So if your child right now needs a parent in the room to fall asleep, maybe the parent is just lying next to them or rubbing their back, or sometimes they just want their parent to be in the room kind of sitting next to their bed. That's a sleep dependency that you might want to think about fading, which is what I'm going to spend the rest of the talk on. The other thing to keep in mind with these sleep dependencies is that you might have something that's helping your child fall asleep, but that isn't always present in the middle of the night, so that when your child wakes up in the middle of the night, if they depend on you to fall asleep at the beginning of the night, then what happens when they wake up in the middle of the night and you're not there? That can often make it really difficult for your child to fall back asleep. They'll often call out for their parents. And then the parents have to go to get their child to fall back asleep because that parent presence has become a sleep dependency for that child. But it could also be things like music, like what I was talking about for myself. It's a cue, that music is a cue for me to fall asleep, but it also works against me sometimes because I don't have that music on the whole night. I have it kind of automatically turn off at about an hour in. So there are nights when, again, when I'm kind of experiencing more stress in my life, when I wake up in the middle of the night, the music isn't on, I start thinking about things, and I don't have that cue that's associated with me falling asleep. So what I try to do now is if I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm not falling back asleep within a couple minutes, I'll turn that music back on because that's become a pretty ingrained sleep dependency for me. Other things, so sometimes we'll see that with children with music that their parents are playing kind of lullabies or kind of just kind of soft music to get their child to fall asleep, which can work out really well. But if your child is waking up in the middle of the night and having difficulty falling back asleep, that's something to consider. Is there another noise or sound you can have that's going throughout the night? So your child doesn't need you to come back and turn that on, or starting to slowly fade that music and replace it with a noise machine, a white noise machine that you could have on throughout the night. We'll see this also with kind of simple things like even stuffed animals. If your child's used to having certain stuffed animals next to them when they fall asleep, that can be a positive sleep dependency unless your child is more active when they're sleeping and those stuffed animals fall out of their bed and then they're waking up in the middle of the night. They don't have their stuffed animals right next to them. If they can't get them themselves, then that's a sleep dependency that you want to address so that they're staying asleep throughout the night. Lastly, what you want to consider with these sleep dependencies is finding things that are transportable. So these are stimuli that aren't dependent on that specific room that your child is in right now. Travel is restricted these days, but when you're traveling, if your child is sleeping somewhere else, doing a sleepover at a friend's house or a grandparent's house, you want to make sure that they can have whatever those sleep dependencies are that they formed, that those can go with them. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions about sleep dependencies? No. Okay. All right, so the rest of the time we're going to be talking about what to do to get your child to fall asleep on their own. This is a big one that a lot of parents struggle with. I'm going to be focusing on one primary strategy, and I'll go through the strategy and tell you why I like that, but also just want to acknowledge that there are lots of other strategies out there to address this. And some of the work I do with families is really talking through those strategies and finding the one that will work best for their family. But this one is a pretty common one that I'll use with pretty good success. So it's called the excuse me drill, just to kind of help parents remember it. But what we're working on is teaching your child how to fall asleep on their own. And we work in really small gradual increments, which I'll show you. I'll show you the schedule in a couple of slides. And the parents often like this because even though it can take some work for the kind of first, I would say 3 to 5 nights, it can take a lot of work for the parents. But if we're doing this right, we should not be seeing your child get upset. So a lot of times what happens is parents are helping their child fall asleep. They might maybe see that their child's starting to fall asleep, try to leave the room, and then their child starts getting upset and wanting their parent to return. And that kind of cycle is continuing because what your child is learning is, okay, I just have to get upset, start crying, and then my parent will return back to the room. With this strategy, we're trying to do it in a way where we're actually coming back in before your child starts to show those signs of distress. So it's slow and gradual, but families often like it because it's avoiding that distress. Versus another common strategy that you might have heard of just kind of letting your child cry it out, which does work for some families. They're kind of able to tolerate their child's distress. But that can be really hard to do as parents. So I'm presenting this as an alternative to just kind of letting your child cry it out. So here's how it works. First, you kind of get your child in bed, get them settled, and then you would say something like, hold on one sec, you don't have to say excuse me. It's kind of whatever language feels comfortable for you, but something like, I just need to go do whatever. I just need to go check on, if there's a sibling, check on so-and-so, or I just need to go kind of write down something, write it, but I'll be right back. So you're telling your child that you're going to be exiting the room, but you're also saying, I'll be right back. And then what you would do is actually leave the room, but you're going to come back before your child shows those signs of distress. And like I said, I'll show you the schedule. Often the first time, you're only out of the room for, let's say, up to 10 seconds. But it really depends on your child and how long they can tolerate you being out of the room. For some children, or if we're doing this with infants, it's actually sometimes they don't tolerate the parent leaving the room at all. And then instead of leaving the room, we'll start with just having the parent leave their child's side. So take a step back from their child and then come back. Or maybe they can go to the other side of the room, but they can't leave the door. So we'll find kind of what's the minimum amount that we can do. We kind of want to push that, but we don't want to push it to a place where your child is starting to get upset. So we want to find that place where that they can tolerate before they're starting to get upset. Once we found that place, then we're gradually increasing the time that the parent is spending out of the room. So, and we're increasing that kind of throughout the night. So the parent comes back, sits with their child, and then a couple minutes later, they say, oh, honey, I need to go just do whatever it is, something quick. I'm going to go get a sip of water for myself, but I'll be right back. And then they leave the room, and then they're coming back in. And throughout the night, we're gradually increasing that interval. Then another piece that we're doing is throughout this is we're thinning the scheduled reinforcement. So what that means is that when the parent is in the room with their child, we're starting to decrease the amount of time that they're in the child's room and decreasing the quality of interactions. So if your child right now needs you to be lying in bed and rubbing their back, we start to slowly fade that. So maybe now the parent's still lying in bed with the child, but not rubbing their back. Then we kind of get the child to sit next to the bed instead of lying in it. So we're slowly fading that. The trick with this strategy, as I've said, is to go slow. So here's a schedule, as you can see kind of what this would look like across time. So on the first day, if your child can tolerate you being out of the room for 10 seconds, but not much longer than that, then we would start there. So the first time the parent leaves the room, they're gone for about 10 seconds. Then they come back, and then they're gonna leave again. And the next time they're leaving for about 30 seconds. Then they come back, and then you can see this first night, it's a lot of work for the parents. it might take 7, it might take more exits, but the goal is every time you're gradually increasing the amount of time and you're getting to a place where your child is tired, they're not getting upset, but when they leave, they know that you're going to come back because you're giving them repeated exposure to that. And you're getting to a place where when you're gone, they're actually starting to fall asleep on their own. So you're trying to get rid of that sleep dependency of them needing you to be there to fall asleep. That second night, then you might be able to increase the time. So starting with 30 seconds and then going up throughout the night. And you can see how across days, you're starting with a higher and higher amount of time. Again, the goal is to fade this, and your child is getting to a place where they're learning how to fall asleep on their own and don't require the parent presence there. Okay, so this strategy can be pretty involved, and a lot of times what I do for families in my practice is I'll actually coach them through the first couple of nights, and we will do that over telehealth now. So I'll kind of be on video, and in the parents are wearing headphones or Bluetooth, and I'm coaching them through so that they're learning kind of when to leave and when to go back and what to say to their child. And again, what we're looking for is coming back before your child gets upset. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions about this?
When you go back in, like,
Yeah.
I mean, how old are you talking about doing this with? Like, is it meant for younger kids, or?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jen. So this can be used anywhere from infants through older children who are struggling with falling asleep on their own. So, you know, around kind of for infancy, it varies for when you want to start this, but I've definitely seen it work with even as young as like 4-month-olds, of getting them to learn how to start falling asleep on their own.
Okay, that makes sense.
There are things, you know, with younger children, especially infants, what I often see is we just have to start smaller. And if they're not tolerating, because some infants are so used to being held by their parents, if they're not tolerating even kind of being put down in their crib, then that's what we'll start targeting and slowly increase that. Yeah. Okay, great question. Anything else? Any other questions about this? Okay. So I'm going to summarize the strategies, and Jen, at the end, if you want me to go into these in any more detail with you, we can do that as well. So the first thing that we've talked about was establishing a bedtime routine. And this really helps with increasing your child's compliance during bedtime. So you want that bedtime routine to be consistent, meaning where you're following the same sequence of activities throughout that routine, kind of across any day of the week, no matter who's putting your child to bed, they're as much as possible sticking to that same sequence of steps. The other piece we talked about was timing. And for this, we talked about actually when you're starting off this intervention or starting to work on bedtime, pushing back bedtime, because we want your child to be really sleepy and we want them to be successful with falling asleep, and then slowly moving that up. And then the last piece we talked about with bedtime routine was visual. So making a schedule of that bedtime routine that you want your child to follow, and having them follow that schedule that's visually represented throughout the routine so that they can see what they've done and what's coming next. The next piece we talked about was bedroom do's and don'ts, so things to keep in mind with your child's bedroom. So keeping the lighting low. You want that to be as dark as possible when they're getting in their bed to fall asleep. Temperature, you wanting that to be on the cooler side. Minimizing distracting noises as much as possible, and using a white noise machine that can be really helpful for children and adults as well to fall asleep and stay asleep. And then thinking about what activities are in your child's room. Next, we talked about sleep dependencies. So these are these kind of cues that signal to us that, okay, it's time to fall asleep. And when we all have these dependencies, we want them to be independent so that they don't depend on another person being present. We want dependencies that can be there throughout the middle of the night, and that can be transportable with your child if your child is sleeping anywhere else. And then lastly, we talked about this excuse me drill of teaching your child how to fall asleep on their own. So going slowly, entering the room before your child gets upset, and then gradually increasing the time that you're outside of the room so that your child is learning how to fall asleep when you're not present. Okay. So based on kind of everything that we've gone through, what I usually encourage families to do is start small, but think about this list of different activities and pick one that's kind of more relevant for you and your family, and also pick something that you think you can commit to trying out over the next week, and kind of really making this action oriented. So writing it down, kind of what your goal is to try, and talking about it with your partner if you have one, and just so that you can both be on the same page, and really committing to trying it over the next week. Okay. Just want to put up these references here. So a lot of the content for this presentation I got from these two sources. There are a lot of people who really specialize in sleep. So if you're interested in other resources, just let me know and I'll try to get some to you. And I'll open it up for questions now. And I just want to kind of remind you guys that bedtime can be really hard for parents to work on because it's a stressful time. There's a lot of pressure around getting your kids to bed and wanting them to get the amount of sleep that they need. And also parents are kind of looking to get their kids to bed so that they can get other things done at night, and so that they can also get sleep themselves. And just reminding you that there are people out there to help families work on this. This is something I do, but other folks do it as well. And if you have questions about kind of what that treatment could look like, don't hesitate to reach out to me. My contact info is here. But I just wanted to open it up to questions now. Anything that you guys want to talk about, kind of how to individualize for your families, or want me to go into in more detail, or think that if I didn't cover something, we can talk about that. It's okay if you don't have questions as well, though. Yeah, Jen?
We have a 4-month-old and a 2 and almost 3-year-old.
Okay.
The 3-year-old is doing fine. Like, she'll fall asleep on her own.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm anticipating we're going to go backwards, like when we move her to a bed.
Mm.
Do you have any, would you kind of use the same thing? Like, I feel like she's going to be like, I need this. I know my covers aren't, I can only.
Yeah. That transition from the crib to the bed can be difficult for a lot of children. So, depending on your child, I might recommend some different things, but what often works well is, priming your child as much as possible. So talking to her about it and kind of getting them ready for that transition, making it seem really exciting, but also talking about kind of what those expectations are. So, okay, when you're in your big girl or big boy bed, we want you to stay in it throughout the night. Here are some things that you'll have in the bed with you and kind of that you can keep close to you, but mommy and daddy are going to be in the other room, and if you need us, you can do this, but we really want you to try to stay in the bed by yourself throughout the night. So just kind of, I think a lot of times parents talk about the positives, but they don't also tell their child what's expected of them. So starting to do that. For other children, what we might need to do if they're really struggling with that transition is pair it with an additional reinforcer. So set up some goals. So, okay, if you can, fall asleep on your own, then the next morning you're going to get to do this fun activity that you don't normally get to do, and kind of setting up maybe a sticker chart to go along with that, something like that. But for some children, that transition is so big, they need some extra kind of reinforcement to go along with that. And then the other piece I'll work with parents on is what's happening kind of when they're getting out of their bed. A lot of times it's either to get access to something or for their parents' attention. So I'll work with parents on how to minimize attention when your child does get out of bed, and how you can kind of get them back in bed, but with giving them minimal attention throughout that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, Jen. Anything else, guys?
Is it better to pair, like you're saying, if you need to pair reinforcement in a positive way than to say, like, than to take something away? Like, if you don't settle down and, like, go to sleep, then we'll have to, put whatever toy away. Like, is it better?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. So, right, there are lots of different strategies. What generally I recommend it, and what is supported by research as well, is you want to start with reinforcement. There are some benefits to reinforcement in that you're teaching your child what you want them to do instead of what not to do. So by focusing on those positives, so I'll usually start with reinforcement. There are times, however, when we've tried reinforcement and your child is still engaging in some of those challenging behaviors. And then depending on the family's comfort level and kind of what they would do anyways, we'll talk about, okay, do we also want to incorporate a consequence strategy where we're taking something fun away? And there are times when I'll do that as well, but usually we'll start with a reinforcement system and try that out.
Okay. I was just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a great question.
Oh my goodness. We, like, if she has a hard time getting ready for bed, like she gets too wild or something, like she's just procrastinating, we'll say, like, if we can't get ready or we can't calm ourselves down, then we'll lose a book. Like, so she gets 2 books, and so she'll get 1 book instead.
Right.
But I don't know if
I think that's fun. Yeah. It's really, when I'm working with families, I'm thinking about what's something that they're going to use. And if that's kind of language that you're already using, then that's fine. And I think the piece that we don't want to have with consequences is a lot of times, instead of it being a real consequence, it's a threat. And it might be a threat that the parents aren't really going to follow through on. So you'll hear things about, okay, if you don't stop doing X, Y, and Z, then we're not going to see grandma tomorrow. Or then, you can't play with whatever tomorrow. And instead, we want the consequences to be more immediate, which is exactly what you explained. Then instead of 2 books, we're only going to do 1. And I think that's a really natural one because there's going to be less time, right? So it's kind of her choice. If you're able to get through these things quickly, then we'll have more time for books. But if not, then we'll only be able to do 1. I think that sounds like an appropriate consequence.
Okay. Well, I think, like, when it comes time to transition to the bed, though, like the sticker chart or something like that, for that realm of that will be good for her.
Yeah, I think that it can be really helpful, especially with a transition like that. Yeah. Any other questions, guys? No. Okay, well, thank you for attending. I know there's a lot going on these days, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join. All right, have a good rest of your weekend and happy Father's Day.